Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about personality, intelligence, values, morality, and God. And you're probably wondering, how does that very strange group of traits and characteristics, how do they all go together? How do they fit in with God? So I'm going to talk a lot about some of the stuff that I teach in my classes, actually, about personality and intelligence. I'm also going to add in some information that I know about cross-cultural values, and then of course across universal morality and more. And so then I'm going to talk about how this all fits into a bigger picture. And so stay tuned. Okay, so realizing now, hang on a second, here we go. Okay. So wondering about personality, one of the things that's really important for people when they're trying to get a job is their personality. Personality is a very important metric. And many companies these days are using personality as a selection tool. So you'll have to take a personality assessment to ensure that you're a good fit for your organization. And one of the primary tools that researchers use, and actually that is not always used in organizations, but researchers tend to really like this particular instrument because it has a lot of validity, is the 5-factor model of personality. And so the 5-factor model of personality refers to these 5 constructs, and you can remember them because of the acronym OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. So we have extroversion, which refers to being sociable. Openness to experience. Those sort of people tend to be open to the arts, open to new ideas. They like to travel. Then there's agreeableness. Those are the people who get along with a lot of people. There's conscientiousness. That's the other idea, the getting ahead idea. So conscientious people tend to be high in achievement orientation. They like to work really hard. They really care about their job, and they care about doing a very good job. Then there's neuroticism, which is its counterpart is emotional stability. So the emotionally unstable would be the neurotic. And that corresponds to high levels of anxiety, worrying, and other characteristics that aren't so great, neuroticism. And you'll notice these numbers that are following each of these are essentially the R coefficients. And so what that is it's a validity coefficient that speaks to whether or not it is correlated with other metrics. So extroversion, you can see, has the highest correlation with leadership. So good leaders tend to be extroverted. And you can see that because the 0.31 is the highest. If you square that, you would say that your extroversion is predicting about 9% of your leadership. You'll notice also that conscientiousness is the highest predictor of job performance. And over here on the right, you're going to see that extroversion and neuroticism are actually tied with high levels of correspondence to job satisfaction. However, neuroticism has a negative relationship, which means basically that neuroticism is high levels of neuroticism equal low levels of job satisfaction, and the corresponding is true as well. Low levels of neuroticism equal higher levels of job satisfaction. You're also going to notice something really interesting here is we have heritability in the parentheses. So for example, extroversion, you're likely to be a little bit more extroverted if your parents are extroverted. And again, you would square these coefficients to get the validity numbers. So you'll see there that extroversion 0.49, openness to experience is 0.45, agreeableness 0.35, conscientiousness 0.38, and neuroticism 0.41. In other words, if your parents are more neurotic, more conscientious, more agreeable, more open, and more extroverted, you're likely to be that way as well. Just a few references. Now there's some other things that are pretty interesting. Intelligence predicts about 25% of performance across all jobs. That's really good to know. So a lot of companies use intelligence also as a tool when they're selecting employees. They find that intelligence even predicts performance across some low-level jobs. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a second. A highly intelligent person is simply going to get bored handing out tickets in a movie theater. That's true. But boredom doesn't speak to your levels of intelligence. Boredom speaks to your likelihood to leave the job. You're performing well on the job while you have it because you're highly intelligent. However, you might want to leave the job if you're not happy in the job. And of course, there's also the elephant in the closet here. What about the other 75% of your job performance? Well, those are factors like your personality. You just remember back here, we've got conscientiousness is a pretty strong predictor. Others have correspondences too. So other things matter. So essentially, you're looking at your motivation, you're looking at personality, you're looking at your experience, your education, lots of factors relate into job performance. Right now, you're saying to yourself, I'm still thinking about the title of this video. Well, we're going to get to that. You're also going to see that heritability of intelligence is there. So depending on the study, it falls anywhere between 0.5 and 0.8 for your heritability of your intelligence, meaning a portion of your intelligence is coming from your parents. So if you have very intelligent parents, 2 doctors, something like that, you're more likely to have higher levels of intelligence yourself. Now, let's get back to that. What about the other? Okay, that speaks to nature. What about nurture? Well, of course, your environment does play a bit of a role. And also, heritability of intelligence increases with your age, according to twin studies and according to other studies. So now we have another interesting theory that's called moral foundations theory. And this happens to be one of my favorites of late. I'm really sort of enjoying this moral foundations theory. And the bottom line of this particular theory, which comes from people like Graham and Haidt, Jonathan Haidt, is that, and let me just try to bring this up so I can see the chat as I'm going here, because I realize as I'm running slides, I can't see the chat while I'm doing this. So there I go. Okay, so we have this idea of care and fairness. Now, what's really interesting is you're going to find across the board, when we even look at global studies, care tends to be something really important universally. I'm going to get into some evidence for that in just a moment. So this study in moral foundations theory essentially says that people have these basic moral foundations. They tend to value care, they tend to value fairness, they tend to value loyalty, sanctity and purity, authority, or liberty. So we have these different foundations. And hold on, I'm trying to get my phone not to make a noise here. Okay, so it's all right. Unable to get to run the chat right yet. So I will have to come to that in just a second. So anyway, going back to this, here's what's very interesting about these foundations. Now, as you're looking at those, think to yourself, which of these would I consider the most important? So think, is it care? Is it fairness? Is it loyalty? These are all important, but here's what's interesting. They vary by as a function of your levels of either being liberal or conservative. So you can see right here, the very liberal tend to have high levels of care. They value care and they value fairness. I mean, that's what they really care about. And you can see right there in this chart. And then you can see as you move further to the right, to the very conservative side, they're more evenly spread out for these particular dimensions. So how does this play out today in today's political climate? Well, this is what's interesting about this. You're going to notice, and I've noticed this, that when Joe Biden is running ads, a lot of his ads right now happen to be attending to the fact that his base really cares about care and fairness. So he talks a lot about helping the weaker. He talks a lot about caring for people. He talks about caring for all people, caring for Black lives, caring for other lives. He cares about a lot of different things, and he's been focusing a lot on that in his political ads. And what's wise about that is because by focusing on what people care about, which is care and fairness, he's appealing to his base in a very novel way, a very good way. He must obviously know some of the studies on this kind of stuff. And what's interesting also is President Trump has decided that he is going to focus on other dimensions of the moral foundations theory that really appeal to his base. So if you look at the conservative side here and you look at this idea of in-group, now that speaks to in-group loyalty, also related to patriotism. Also, you'll see the appeal to authority, okay? So President Trump likes to have lots of political ads that speak to levels of loyalty, patriotism, lots of flags flying, the military, strength, power. Again, you're seeing that completely play out, okay? So that's what's going to go on right now. So I want you to look for that when you're looking out into the political climate and wondering, why is President Trump investing all of this money to go to Mount Rushmore on the 4th of July and to show everybody him standing there with flags all around, no one's wearing masks. I won't even get into that. But that was something that we were noticing was going on. So now we also have this idea of the dark triad of personality. And in case you're interested in the dark triad of personality, these are 3 personality traits that you don't want to have. Okay, so you don't want to be a narcissist. Those are people who feel superior to others and they seek admiration and special treatment. You don't want to be Machiavellian, because those are people who manipulate others and they use deceit and lies. And you don't want to be a psychopath. I don't need to tell you that, but about 1% of the population is considered psychopath. Now, does that mean that they don't know what's morally right or wrong? No, actually, a study has shown they do know what's morally right and wrong. They just don't care. So you do want to screen employees for levels of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopaths, because a meta-analysis has shown us, so this is giving us validity evidence. So this means I have validation for using a selection tool that screens employees for this sort of trait, these sorts of traits. So a meta-analysis by Boyle and other colleagues in 2012 basically said that psychopathy and Machiavellianism were correlated with reductions of the quality of job performance, and counterproductive work behaviors are associated with all 3 domains. Now, what are counterproductive work behaviors? That's that person in the office who takes credit for your work. That's that person who figures out a way to make the company do something bad. What's really interesting is when we look at levels of engagement in companies, there are several different levels. At one level, about 30% of your employees are considered highly engaged. That's followed by 53% of your employees who are hanging out there. They're kind of hanging out, they're checking the boxes. And then there's this other strange little percentage, the 17% of your employees who are actively disengaged and looking to harm you. You have a group of people, that's the average in the United States. Okay, so the Gallup poll is conducted every year looking for levels of employee engagement, and they have found that this varies. And they found that there's actually sometimes between 18, 17%, right around there, of your employees are actively disengaged, looking to harm you. Those are those people hunkered down in the little bunker outside of your organization, figuring out ways to manipulate the company, manipulate you, not do any work for the company. Hey, let's all go get unionized so that we can have protections, and then let's slow down the output. Okay, that's that kind of employee. So obviously you want to do a little bit of screening to find those sorts of people. And I would say that something you might want to be paying attention to are these traits, these personality traits. Research has also found, now this is kind of interesting, your birth order is important. And I wouldn't say to be screening employees for birth order. We don't have any sort of things like that. But we do know that if you are born later, you're more likely to take higher strategic or financial risks. You're more likely to switch jobs and more likely to have a greater risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is kind of a crazy thing there. Now, here's another thing, and I was meaning to put this into the debate that I did yesterday on morality, so I figured it would kind of fit in here a little bit, sort of. I'm going to squeeze it in here anyway. So talking a little bit about humane orientation, and that's another personality trait. It's essentially a value. Actually, not so much a personality. Yeah, it's kind of it's a personality, a value. It's something like that. I would put it more in the value category than the personality trait, now that I think about it. Okay, so the Globe study was conducted by a number of authors, over 60 countries, in thousands of people surveyed. And they found that scholars distinguish societal practices, what they'd say is as is. What are the practices in your society? They say, what are your levels of humane orientation from your perceptions? People would check the box on what they felt was going on in their country. And then they would say, well, how should it be? How ought it to be? What was interesting in humane orientation is in every single country, the is was much lower than the ought to be. So people knew they ought to have higher levels of humane orientation. However, they realized in their culture, it's lower, it's a little bit lower. Now I'm going to get into just a second which is the lowest and which is the highest and what that means for us. So this value corresponds to benevolence and universalism, and it's defined as the degree to which an organization or society encourages and rewards individuals for being fair, altruistic, friendly, generous, caring, and kind. Doesn't that remind us of something? We just went to the Haidt study, the Jonathan Haidt study, and talked about care being really important to people. You can see here, humane orientation is a value, a moral foundation. Is something very important to people. You'll also find, if you go to Shalom Schwartz studies, that the top 2 values that people care about are benevolence, which is loyalty and care for the in-group, and also universalism, which is care for the out-group. Okay, so here's what's interesting. Here are the countries with the highest to lowest levels of humane orientation. Look at this. So the highest of all the countries they surveyed in the Globe study was Zambia, followed by the Philippines, Ireland, Malaysia, Thailand, and Egypt. Okay, they had the highest levels of humane orientation. Where are they the lowest? Where are people less caring about others generally? Or you can expect to see higher levels of that on average. That doesn't mean every single person in every single country has high levels of this stuff. It means this is the average number. So in West Germany, they actually distinguish West and East Germany. West was a little bit higher than all of them, but West was higher than East Germany. So West Germany, Spain, Greece, Hungary, France, and East Germany, Singapore, South Africa, Switzerland, Poland, and Italy. Now, what do you notice about these countries? What do they have in common? As I look kind of generally at the lower levels and the higher levels, I'm noticing there's a GDP variation here. Okay, so most of the countries that have the lowest levels of care and humane orientation tend to be these European countries with high general levels of gross domestic product. And the poorer countries tend to have these lower levels, okay? Lower levels of money, but higher levels of humane orientation. So what does that mean? That means a lot of times if you're impoverished, you're helping other people. And if you're in these higher countries like Germany and places like that, which have high safety, social safety nets, the government takes care of the weak and the poor. You don't have to do that so much. You have a welfare system that's taking care of them, out of sight, out of mind. Therefore, your levels of humane orientation, boom, sort of drop. So that's what happened. Yes, and indeed, this actually corresponds. So you can see right here that your humane orientation corresponds to your percentage of inhabitants living in urban settings. In other words, you can see here that if you have high levels of humane orientation, you have lower levels of people living in urban settings, followed by, wait a second. Yeah, so lower life expectancy, higher levels of humane orientation, lower human development, high levels of humane orientation, higher levels of infant mortality rate, higher levels of humane orientation, high maternity mortality, high humane orientation. So you can basically see what's going on here. The worse conditions in your country, the higher levels of humane orientation, the nicer, the caring, those sorts of people are more likely to be around. So it does correspond. Access to safe water and gross domestic product as well. So again, low levels of gross domestic product, high levels of humane orientation. Okay, so I don't know if I said the first one incorrectly, so I'm gonna go back. Low levels of percentage of inhabitants, so low urbanites, less big cities, more farm areas, more agrarian areas, higher levels of humane orientation. So what does this mean? So let's take a look again. Let's just analyze the most and the least levels of humane orientation. And you can see here that Zambia is 95.5% Christian with an infant mortality rate of 56 deaths per 1,000 births and a life expectancy of 53.6 years. Again, if you remember, it has the highest levels of humane orientation. Now, Germany, they didn't distinguish East and West because, of course, as you know, that came down a long time ago. 1989. Germany is 53.2% Christian with an infant mortality rate of 3.3 deaths out of every 1,000 live births and a life expectancy of 81.1 years. How does this all work out? Well, think about this. Think about this. The places with the highest level of suffering happen to have the highest levels of care. People finish their jobs. They do a really good job for God. God basically says, well done, good and faithful servant. It's time for you to come to heaven. So another thing that I want to talk about just briefly, and I just got a little bit of a cough here, so excuse me, is Romans 2:15. I've got something that's going to blend this all with God. So Romans 2:15 says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. So in multiple studies of hundreds of samples in 82 countries and representing culturally diverse people of varying ages, genders, occupations, and geographies, Schwartz drew a conclusion that he considered astonishing. After ranking 10 values in order of importance, results indicated universals across the whole globe. The vast majority ranked benevolence as number one, as the most important value, followed by universalism and self-direction. In the couple of exceptions, universalism was number one, followed by benevolence. Other studies have shown recurrent values. So for example, we've got Dalsgaard in 2005 found that these recurrent values were noticed across 8 religious traditions: courage, temperance, justice, transcendence, humanity, and wisdom. Westmark in 1906 identified universals in the approval of honesty, charity, mutual aid, generosity, along with the prohibition of theft and homicide. And Heinrich and colleagues in 2005 examined 15 societies, finding that fairness and trust were exhibited by all. My last slide that I just showed you, the conscience, the way the conscience is within us, is something for you to consider. Why is it that humanity is geared this way? Why are we hardwired to seek such good values? Where did this come from? As we noticed at the outset, I pointed out some correlations between your heritability and certain traits, certain characteristics. So certainly some of what you are has been inherited from your parents. Some of what you are is your environment. But also some of these moral values, which speak to your moral duties, which is a prescription, does not speak to what you're born with, okay? Biology can only explain descriptively the as-is situation. It can't explain how you know you ought to do something right. You ought to follow the golden rule, or those sorts of things. What's really interesting is, even if you're looking at studies of major world religions, atheism, humanism, and the United Nations, all of them realize that people should have a commitment to something greater than themselves. There's a self-respect, but with humility, self-discipline, and acceptance of personal responsibility. People realize that they should value respect and caring for others, and then caring for other living things and the environment. So what's the bottom line? How do I put all these together? Well, I'm going to just say that what you are, you're made in the image of God. You are given certain characteristics, and you're given a lot of special gifts. No one has no gifts. Everybody has a gift. We go back to the parable of the minas, and we take a look at that, and we realize that as everyone has these special gifts, God expects you to invest your gifts, and he wants you to use them wisely. So figure out what you're good at. Figure out what you do that you don't feel like you're working, because there certainly is something that you're doing where you're not feeling like you're working. And figure out how you can capitalize on that particular asset to make yourself to do what you're expected to do in the eyes of God. So I want to say thank you so much, everybody. Please like and subscribe, and do come again. Bye-bye.